The winter of 1881 came down on Leadville, Colorado, like a coffin lid. Snow piled high against the clapboard fronts of saloons and boarding houses, muffling the sound of boots on the frozen boardwalks. The mines had slowed with the weather, and the men who dug silver from the Rocky Mountains came into town restless, half mad with isolation and drink. Leadville was a place of extremes, riches for a few, misery for most, and vice for anyone who could afford it. On Harrison Avenue, the heart of town, one saloon burned brighter than most. Its windows glowed warm against the bitter winds, and its doors swung open to laughter, music, and the promise of escape. It was called the McKenna Sisters Saloon. From the outside, it looked no different from the dozen other dens of liquor and sin that lined the street. But inside, it had an atmosphere men swore by. The beer flowed freely, the tables never stayed empty, and the two sisters who owned it, Margaret and Annie McKenna, had a way of making every man feel welcome. Margaret was the elder, tall and commanding, with a sharp wit and a voice that could cut through the din. Annie, the younger by 5 years, was softer in appearance with dark hair and a smile that disarmed even the hardest miner. Together they built their saloon into one of the most profitable establishments in Leadville. To most who passed through their doors, the McKenna sisters were simply shrewd businesswomen in a rough world. They served beer with charm, offered music with melancholy, and provided company that eased the loneliness of the mountains. But beneath that veneer of warmth, something darker festered. It wasn't until the early months of 1881, when a deputy sheriff followed a trail of disappearances, that the truth began to claw its way into daylight. The first to vanish was a girl named Lila Hart, a laundress from Denver who had come to Leadville chasing the mining boom. She was young, no more than 20, with blonde hair she wore in a braid and a laugh that could turn heads in a room. She was last seen entering the McKenna Sisters Saloon late on a Friday night, her wages jingling in her pocket. She never came out. At first no one questioned it. Girls came and went in Leadville all the time, swept along by promises of work or men who took them elsewhere. But within weeks, 2 more women were gone. By February, whispers spread through the camps. A dressmaker from Kansas, a cook from Missouri, a schoolteacher's daughter who had taken a job serving drinks. All young, all poor, all desperate enough to spend time at the McKenna Sisters establishment. Their absence gnawed at the edges of conversation, but men in the camps were slow to notice. After all, the mining town was transient by nature. People vanished like smoke. What disturbed the authorities was not just the disappearances, but the discovery that came when a floorboard in the saloon was pried loose during a routine inspection. The deputy had come to check on liquor licensing, nothing more. But when his boot struck hollow wood, curiosity led him to lift the plank. Beneath, in a shallow crawl space, he found bundles of cloth stacked with unsettling neatness. At first he thought it was storage for the saloon, old costumes, forgotten belongings. But as he pulled one bundle free, he felt the weight of something more sinister. The bundle contained a woman's dress, carefully folded, along with shoes, stockings, and undergarments. Tucked inside was a scrap of paper, written in neat, deliberate hand. It read, Clara Jameson, age 19, brown hair, blue eyes. 65 dough shaken. The deputy examined another bundle. Inside was a red wool skirt, worn but clean, and another note, Ellen Carter, age 23, auburn hair, scar on right cheek, $80. There were 23 such bundles in total, each one catalogued with chilling precision. Clothing folded like merchandise, notes that read more like inventory tags than anything human. Names, ages, physical descriptions, and prices, as if each woman had been appraised and assigned value. And yet, not a single one of those women had been seen in Leadville for months. The deputy called in the sheriff, and within hours the saloon was under lock. The McKenna sisters were taken into custody, protesting their innocence with all the fury they could muster. Margaret insisted the bundles were nothing more than lost property, items left behind by girls who had moved on. Annie wept, swearing they knew nothing of the disappearances. But the careful folding, the handwritten notes, the ledger-like detail, it was too much to explain away. When word spread through Leadville, panic rippled through the camps. Men who had drunk at the sisters' tables recalled glimpses of girls who had served them once and never again. Women whispered warnings to one another, avoiding the saloon as though it carried a plague. The sheriff's office was flooded with rumors, each one darker than the last. Some claimed the sisters ran a hidden trade, selling women to mining camps in the mountains or to brothels in Denver. Others whispered of something worse, that the missing girls had been used up and disposed of, their clothing all that remained to tell their stories. What made the discovery so haunting was the silence it implied. 23 names, 23 sets of clothing, 23 women who had walked into the saloon and never been seen again. And not one grave, not one body to account for them. Only notes, cold as business entries, that recorded their existence as though they were cattle, not human souls. The investigation stretched for weeks. Deputies scoured the hillsides, searching for shallow graves in the snow. They dug through abandoned shafts, combed riverbanks, questioned drifters and gamblers. Nothing. It was as if the women had been swallowed whole by the mountains. The sisters held fast to their story. The clothes were left behind, nothing more. But the precision of the cataloguing mocked their denials. Each bundle told a story of ownership, of someone who had taken the time to write, to measure, to value. When the case reached court later that spring, the evidence was damning but incomplete. Without bodies, without eyewitnesses, the prosecutor could only paint the sisters as suspicious custodians of a macabre collection. The defense argued the bundles were the remnants of women who had sold their clothes for money, as was sometimes done by those desperate to leave town. The jury, made up of miners and merchants, wrestled with the horror of the discovery and the lack of hard proof. In the end, the sisters were acquitted of murder, though the town never forgave them. The saloon closed, its doors barred, its windows shattered by stones in the night. Margaret and Annie fled Leadville soon after, vanishing into the west as mysteriously as the women whose belongings they had kept. Some said they went south, others that they crossed into Mexico. No one ever saw them again, but the story did not die. The bundles were kept in the sheriff's office for years, morbid relics of a crime no one could prove but no one could forget. Travelers came through Leadville and heard the tale, shuddering as they imagined the faces behind the folded clothes. Parents warned their daughters never to linger in strange saloons, never to trust a smile too easily given. And among the miners, the legend of the McKenna sisters grew into something darker than fact. They became figures of folklore, specters who preyed on the lonely and the desperate, their laughter still echoing through the saloon long after it had collapsed into ruin. Even now, some say the old lot where the saloon once stood is haunted. On winter nights, when the wind howls down from the mountains and snow blankets the town, passers-by claim to hear the faint sound of glasses clinking, of women's voices raised in laughter. Others swear they've seen figures moving behind frosted windows, though the building itself has long since burned to the ground. And always the story returns to the bundles beneath the floorboards. 23. Silent witnesses to a mystery that has never been solved. The grim history of the McKenna sisters remains one of the darkest tales of the Wild West. A reminder that cruelty wears many faces, and that sometimes the most dangerous smiles are those that greet you across a bar, offering warmth while hiding cold calculation. In the end, the truth may never be known. Were the sisters traffickers, selling women into lives worse than death? Were they murderers, disposing of bodies in the endless shafts of the mines? Or were they simply caretakers of abandoned belongings, caught in the web of rumor and fear? The mountains keep their secrets, and Leadville, for all its silver, has never unearthed an answer. What remains is the horror of absence, the weight of names without bodies, the echo of lives erased. 23 women walked into the McKenna Sisters Saloon. None walked out. After the trial ended and the sisters slipped out of Leadville, the town was left with more questions than answers. For weeks after their departure, men gathered in the remaining saloons and chewed on the story like gristle. Everyone had a theory. Some swore the sisters had been part of a ring that sold women down to brothels in Trinidad and Pueblo, trading flesh for gold dust and whiskey. Others whispered that the sisters themselves were killers, luring young women with promises of work, then disposing of them in the abandoned shafts that riddled the hills around town. Still others leaned into the supernatural, muttering that the sisters had made a pact with something unholy, something that demanded offerings. And 23 women had been the price. The sheriff's office, meanwhile, carried the burden of evidence. Those bundles of clothing, each one tagged with a name and a price, became infamous. Visitors asked to see them, as though they were relics in some grim museum. For years they sat in a locked chest, but eventually, one by one, the notes were lost to time, stolen, or destroyed. By the turn of the century, all that remained were scattered memories and a few brittle scraps of paper tucked away in private collections. But for the people of Leadville, the legend refused to die. Stories began to circulate of miners who swore they had seen strange lights flickering near the ruins of the saloon. One man claimed he was walking home late after a night shift when he heard a woman's laughter drifting from the empty lot. Another said he passed the boarded remains of the saloon and saw a face staring at him from a broken window. A pale woman with dark eyes, smiling as though she knew his name. These tales traveled quickly through the camps, and before long, the McKenna sisters were no longer simply remembered. They were feared. By 1885, the story had become a campfire staple. New arrivals to the mines would be told of the Sisters of Leadville on their first week in town. The tale always began the same. 2 women, beautiful and clever, running a saloon that promised warmth in the cruel winters. Then came the disappearances, the bundles of clothing, the notes cataloguing the lost like livestock. Some tellings were embellished with grisly detail, the sound of bodies being dragged across floorboards, the echo of screams beneath the laughter of piano music. Others leaned into the supernatural, painting the sisters as witches who had stolen the youth of the missing women to keep themselves alive. Yet, amid the wild rumors, there were quieter, more chilling accounts that seemed harder to dismiss. A man named Joseph Raines, who had worked as a bartender in another establishment down the street, claimed he had seen the sisters accept girls into their saloon late at night, ushering them in through the back entrance. They never came out the front, he said in an affidavit written years later. You'd see a girl go in with a bundle, and that was the last anyone laid eyes on her. Raines admitted he never saw what became of the women, but the memory haunted him until his death. Even more disturbing were the whispers that a few of the women had family who came searching. One miner told the story of a brother who arrived from Kansas, looking for his sister who had last written from Leadville. He went to the McKenna sisters begging for answers. They told him she had left for Denver, sold her belongings for train fare, and never looked back. The brother searched for months, but he never found her. I looked in every camp, every station, every shack from here to Pueblo, he told another man. If she left, she didn't leave by train. That brother died in the mines years later. Still cursing the sisters' names, the legend grew heavier with each retelling. And as decades passed, the story warped into folklore. By the early 1900s, Leadville had quieted. The silver boom had faded. The mines were fewer, and the town had settled into a slower rhythm. But the lot where the saloon once stood remained untouched. People said no one would build there. Carpenters refused the work. Buyers passed it over no matter how cheap the land became. They said it was cursed ground, and even the bravest of men crossed the street rather than walk past it on a winter night. There were ghost stories, too many to count. Travelers claimed to hear piano music drifting from the snow, a sad waltz played with trembling keys. Others described seeing lanterns glowing faintly where the saloon's windows once had been. On more than one occasion, a woman's voice was said to call out, soft and beckoning, before dissolving into laughter. Some swore they saw the missing women themselves, figures in old-fashioned dresses, faces pale as chalk, drifting near the lot before vanishing in the snow. By then, the McKenna sisters were long gone, but in folklore, they had become immortal. No longer just saloon keepers, they were ghoulish figures of the frontier, symbols of what the Wild West could hide beneath its dust and glamour. In dime novels and newspaper columns, they were written as villains, murderesses who preyed on the innocent. Some authors painted them as victims of their own greed, women who had tried to survive in a man's world and gone too far. Others called them vampires, both literal and figurative, draining the life of young women to sustain their own. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the fear. What makes the story endure even now is the absence of resolution. 23 names and not a single body. The folded clothes spoke louder than any confession, but without the remains there was no closure, no justice. The missing women simply vanished into the Colorado winter, leaving only silence and legend behind. Decades later, historians and amateur sleuths tried to untangle the story. Some argued the sisters were indeed traffickers, selling women to brothels in Denver or Cheyenne. The prices on the notes, they suggested, were not payments received, but values assigned for transactions. Others believed the sisters themselves had killed the women, using poison in their drinks, or leading them into the mountains under false pretenses. Skeptics dismissed it all as hysteria, claiming the bundles were simply pawned belongings, catalogued by practical women who ran a business in a chaotic town. Yet, the careful notes, the names, ages, descriptions, still defy easy explanation. One detail that continues to unsettle is the handwriting. Survivors who saw the bundles said the notes were written in two distinct hands, one sharp and angular, the other flowing and soft, as though each sister had taken part in recording the grim inventory. That fact, more than any other, bound them to the crime in the public imagination. Whatever the truth, they had both touched the notes, both catalogued the lives reduced to paper and cloth. Through the 20th century, ghost hunters and journalists returned to the story. In the 1930s, a reporter from Denver claimed to have found one of the original notes, yellowed and torn, tucked in the drawer of a retired deputy's desk. It read, Sarah McLeod, age 21, black hair, green eyes, 72 low. The reporter published the story in a local paper, and for a brief moment, the McKenna sisters haunted the headlines once more. In the 1970s, a group of paranormal investigators set up equipment on the saloon's former lot. They recorded static bursts, strange fluctuations in temperature, and what one member swore was the faint sound of a woman crying. Even now, the legend lingers in Leadville. Tour guides tell the story to visitors who come to see the old mining town preserved in time. They point to the empty lot and lower their voices, describing how 23 women walked in and never walked out. Some tours go further, claiming you can still hear the scratching of pens on paper, as if unseen hands continue to catalogue souls long after the sisters vanished. It is a story that gnaws at the edges of history, a reminder that the West was not just saloon shootouts and dusty trails, but also shadows and secrets that never made it into the textbooks. The McKenna sisters represent that darkness, the cruelty that can hide beneath charm, the horror that can be folded neatly and stored away, waiting to be uncovered. For those who still live in Leadville, the legend is less entertainment and more warning. Parents tell their children not to wander near the lot after dark. Old-timers shake their heads when the subject comes up, muttering that some things are better left buried. But the mountain air carries memory, and the snow preserves stories the way it preserves bones. And so, every winter, when the wind cuts sharp through the alleys and the nights feel endless, someone claims to hear the echo of a woman's laugh, soft and mocking, drifting from where the McKenna sisters once poured beer and kept secrets. No one ever knew what became of Margaret and Annie McKenna. They slipped from Leadville as easily as smoke rises from a chimney, carried away by the winds of rumor. Some said they fled south, traveling by wagon across the plains until they reached Texas, where they opened another saloon under a different name. A few insisted they crossed the border into Mexico, vanishing into towns where their accents would draw no suspicion. Still others whispered that they never made it that far at all, that vigilantes caught them on the trail out of Leadville, dragged them into the woods, and left them in unmarked graves. No records were ever found, no confirmed sightings, no death certificates. They simply evaporated, leaving only their legend behind. Yet even in their absence, they haunted the West. In the 1890s, a sheriff in Santa Fe claimed he encountered two women running a boarding house who matched the sisters' descriptions almost exactly. They were older, heavier, but their eyes carried the same sharp calculation. He never confronted them, but he swore until his dying day it had been Margaret and Annie. In 1904, a miner in Arizona wrote a letter to a Denver newspaper describing a saloon in Bisbee where the proprietors, two sisters from Colorado, kept odd bundles in a locked trunk behind the bar. "I will never forget the way they looked at me," he wrote, "as though they were measuring me for something I couldn't see." Whether these were genuine sightings or simply the spread of folklore, the McKenna name had become a ghostly brand stamped across the West. Those who lived through the Leadville scandal aged into silence, but their children and grandchildren grew up with the story whispered over firesides and kitchen tables. The 23 bundles became a kind of shorthand for evil in a town that had already seen its share of violence. Whenever a girl went missing in the mountains, the old folks would say, "The sisters took her." Whenever a man stumbled home drunk and swore he heard laughter in the snow, people shook their heads and muttered, "That's the McKennas." In this way, the sisters were preserved, not in history books but in the imaginations of those who carried their story forward. By the 1920s, Leadville had transformed into something quieter. The mines had dwindled and the town had shifted toward tourism, selling nostalgia of the frontier days. The lot where the saloon once stood was still vacant, but now it was part of the town's mystique, an eerie landmark that tour guides could point to with lowered voices. Writers from Denver and even as far as Chicago came to investigate the story. They dug through the courthouse records, sifted through newspaper clippings, and hunted for surviving artifacts. Most found nothing concrete, but they always left with enough to write a column, enough to stir the imagination of readers hungry for tales of the Wild West's darker corners. One journalist, a woman named Mary Redfield, wrote in 1926 that she had tracked down a retired deputy who had been present when the bundles were first uncovered. His memory was failing, but he remembered the smell of the crawl space beneath the saloon. "It wasn't just dust," he said. "It was something fouler, something that clung to your clothes after you came up. We never found bodies, but I swear to God they were there once." Redfield's article ran in several papers, and though historians dismissed it as sensationalism, it added fuel to the fire. Now the sisters weren't just saloon keepers who trafficked women, they were killers, hiding corpses in the cold earth until nothing was left but memory and cloth. In the decades that followed, ghost stories layered themselves over the history until the two were inseparable. In the 1940s, when Leadville saw a small resurgence in mining, workers returning to the camps claimed the sisters had returned too. A foreman reported that one of his men refused to work after claiming he'd seen two women standing at the edge of a shaft, watching him without blinking. Another miner swore he heard the sound of skirts swishing in the darkness of a tunnel, though no woman had been anywhere near the mine. These accounts were laughed off, yet they spread, feeding into the legend of the cursed sisters who lingered where silver veins and broken lives intersected. By the 1960s, Leadville embraced the macabre reputation. Ghost tours included the saloon lot as a regular stop, and storytellers leaned hard into the horror. Some said the sisters poisoned women with drinks laced in laudanum, dragging their unconscious bodies into the crawl space before the customers even noticed they were gone. Others claimed they ran a secret passage beneath the saloon that led to the old mine shafts, where the missing women were disposed of in endless black tunnels. The most chilling version suggested the sisters had killed not for profit, but for pleasure, that the notes were not records of sales, but trophies, souvenirs of each life they extinguished. Even in modern times, the story persists. Paranormal investigators bring their equipment to the lot, setting up cameras and recorders. Many claim to capture anomalies, bursts of static, the faint sound of laughter, even voices whispering names. Some report that their devices malfunction entirely when placed on the soil where the saloon once stood. Visitors often describe a heaviness in the air, a sudden chill even in the warmth of summer, and the unshakable feeling that they are being watched. What keeps the McKenna sisters alive in memory is not proof of what they did, but the impossibility of knowing for sure. If bodies had been found, the story might have ended with arrests, convictions, and closure. Instead, it is the silence, the absence that makes it so enduring. 23 bundles beneath the floorboards, 23 names, 23 women who walked into the saloon and never came out again. Their belongings catalogued with the precision of an accountant, but their lives erased from the record. It is this void, this unanswered question, that haunts Leadville still. For some, the story is a cautionary tale about trust and survival in a lawless land. For others, it is a reminder of how easily women, especially poor and working women, disappeared in the West, their vanishings barely raising alarm until it was too late. To folklorists, it is proof of how stories take root, evolving with each telling until they straddle the line between fact and myth. And to those who still believe in spirits, it is evidence that restless souls do not go quietly into the earth, but linger where their stories were stolen from them. Every few years, someone claims to have rediscovered one of the notes. A scrap of paper in a private collection, a page in an old trunk, a letter that seems too precise to be a forgery. Whether genuine or fabricated, these fragments rekindle interest, reminding people that behind the ghost story were real women whose names were once written down. Clara, Ellen, Sarah, Lila, names that belonged to daughters and sisters, each with her own story that ended abruptly in Leadville. The legend of the McKenna sisters may have grown monstrous, but at its core are those 23 women still missing, still waiting to be found. If you walk through Leadville today, you can still stand on the ground where the saloon once stood. There is no marker, no plaque, no monument to what was uncovered there. Just a patch of land, quiet and unassuming, surrounded by the relics of a once booming mining town. But if you linger, if you listen closely, some say you will hear it. The faint sound of piano music drifting on the wind, a melody with no source. Others claim that if you press your ear to the earth, you will hear scratching, as though someone is still trying to write names into a ledger below your feet. The story of the McKenna sisters is not one of six-shooters and outlaw duels, nor of famous sheriffs and railroad barons. It is a quieter, crueler history, one that unfolded in the shadow of the silver boom. It is a reminder that the Wild West was not only violent in the open, but also insidious in its hidden corners, where charm and laughter masked something much darker. And perhaps that is why it endures. Because in every saloon that promised warmth on a winter night, there was always the chance that something waited beneath the floorboards. Something catalogued, something that measured a life not in love or memory but in dollars and cents. Something that could vanish a woman so thoroughly that only her dress remained, folded neatly as though prepared for inventory. The McKenna sisters may never be found again, not in the flesh, not in the records. But their story clings to the mountains of Colorado like frost. It hangs in the air of Leadville, breathed in with every gust of snow. And as long as people gather in the dark to tell stories of the Old West, their names will be spoken, not as businesswomen or hostesses, but as figures of dread. The sisters who served more than beer, the women who smiled while the town looked the other way, the keepers of the bundles, the writers of the notes, the ghosts of Leadville who turned a saloon into a grave without bodies. Some said the McKenna sisters' story should have ended with the gallows. Justice, in its rough Western way, had been delivered. But evil like theirs does not end neatly with a drop of the rope. It lingers, seeps, and burrows into the soil of a place until the very air feels stained. Leadville discovered this in the years that followed. When the sisters' names were never spoken above a whisper, and yet their shadow hung over the mining camp like the smell of smoke after a fire. The saloon itself stood empty for a time, its doors padlocked by order of the sheriff, its windows boarded, its liquor and furnishings carted away to satisfy debts. But buildings hold memory, and the McKenna Saloon seemed unwilling to surrender its secrets. Workmen sent to dismantle the bar swore they heard soft tapping under the floorboards, like fingers drumming in impatience. Others claimed they caught the smell of perfume, cheap rosewater and lilac, despite the saloon being gutted of all bottles and clothing. One man quit mid-job, shaking, muttering that he had seen a pair of women's boots walking across the dust with no legs above them. By the spring of 1882, no one in town would take the building, even when the county offered it at a fraction of its worth. Men who had braved blasting tunnels deep in the mountain, who had faced drunken shootouts in the muddy streets, would cross to the other side rather than walk past the boarded saloon. Leadville was a place hardened by snow and violence, yet there was something in that silent building that even the hardest miners would not confront. The city fathers tried to put the affair behind them. The McKenna sisters were buried in unmarked graves beyond the town cemetery fence, as was custom for criminals. The trial transcripts were filed away, the belongings of the missing women stored in the sheriff's office before being quietly destroyed in a fire some years later. But Leadville's women, particularly those who worked the dance halls and the back rooms of the gambling dens, would not let the memory fade. To them, the Sisters' Saloon was not merely a crime scene. It was a warning, a testament to how easily women, poor women, immigrant women, desperate women, could vanish in the clamor of the West, their absence noted only in the cruel ledger of predators. One dance hall girl, who later gave her name as May, claimed she had once been lured to the sisters' place with the promise of steady work. She remembered the way Molly McKenna's eyes had scanned her like merchandise, and the way Annie's smile never reached her eyes. Something in her bones told her to leave, and she fled before the night ended. When she heard of the trial, she wept. It could have been me, she told anyone who would listen. It near was me, stories like May's spread. And soon the McKenna sisters became less flesh and blood criminals and more specters, haunting the imaginations of every woman who ever tied her corset too tight or painted her lips in hopes of a good night's earnings. The sisters became a shorthand. If a girl disappeared, people muttered, "The McKenna got her." If a miner boasted of cheap company found too easily, someone would whisper, "Better count your luck, or you'll end up like those poor souls under the sisters' floorboards." It was not long before the story began to warp, to grow. In some retellings, the number of missing women rose from 23 to 50, then 100. Some swore the sisters had accomplices in Denver and Cripple Creek, that they ran a chain of hidden brothels where girls were bought, used, and discarded. Others whispered that the sisters were not women at all, but demons wearing human skin, feeding on fear as much as flesh. In the long winters, when the mountain winds howled and snow buried the streets, miners told these stories in boarding houses to scare each other, the firelight flickering across their anxious faces. By the 1890s, when Leadville's silver boom had collapsed and the town shrank back into a skeleton of its former self, the McKenna legend had become a kind of folk tale. Travelers claimed to see two women in faded dresses wandering the outskirts of town, faces pale as moonlight, eyes black as coal. They would beckon, sweet and slow, before vanishing into the snowdrifts. Locals said it was Molly and Annie, still hunting, still seeking to lure the desperate and the lonely into their web. Some even believed the sisters cursed Leadville itself. The town never truly recovered from the bust. Mines closed, saloons shuttered, whole streets fell silent. Other towns rose and prospered, but Leadville seemed trapped, weighed down by ghosts. "We dug up too much," one old-timer said. "Not just silver. We dug up things that ought to stayed buried." The McKenna are part of that. The legend followed the miners as they scattered to other camps. In Telluride, Cripple Creek, even into Wyoming, men spoke of the sisters as though they were still alive. If a man vanished after payday, it was said he had taken supper with the McKenna. If a saloon girl turned up dead in an alley, whispers linked it to the sisters' ghostly revenge. They had become archetypes, symbols of predatory evil disguised in lace and smiles. Newspapers occasionally revived the tale whenever business was slow. A Denver sheet in 1898 ran a lurid story describing the sisters as vampires of the Rockies, painting them as both alluring and monstrous. The article claimed their spirits walk the saloon still, calling out the names of their victims in the dark. Other papers followed, embellishing, sensationalizing, until the line between history and ghost story blurred completely. Meanwhile, the actual families of the missing women were left with nothing but silence. A few relatives journeyed to Leadville in the years after the trial, clutching faded photographs, hoping to recover even a scrap of their loved ones' belongings. They found only boarded doors, wary eyes, and the cold indifference of a town eager to move on. Some left flowers at the unmarked graves, uncertain if the bones beneath the dirt were kin or killer. For them, closure never came. By the early 20th century, the McKenna Saloon was finally torn down. Its timbers were hauled away, some reused in barns or sheds on the outskirts of town. But strange stories clung to the lumber. A horse stable built from its beams caught fire twice in one season, though no lantern was near. A prospector's shack made from its planks collapsed in calm weather, killing the man inside. People said the wood itself was cursed, soaked through with the misery of the women who had disappeared there. And still, the legend endured. Even today, in Leadville's ghost tours and historical walking trails, the McKenna sisters earn a mention. Guides lower their voices, lanterns swaying, and tell of the winter of 1881 when investigators pried up floorboards and found 23 bundles, folded neat as Sunday laundry, each tagged with a name and a price. Guests shiver. Some laugh nervously, but all remember. The sisters have become inseparable from Leadville's history, as real as the mines and the snow. What makes the story so enduring, so chilling, is not just the crime itself. It is the unsettling reminder that evil does not always come with a snarling face or a pistol in hand. Sometimes it comes smiling, in the guise of sisterly charm, serving whiskey with a laugh, promising warmth on a cold night. Molly and Annie McKenna were not gunfighters or highwaymen. They were saloon keepers, women who played the piano, who poured drinks. And yet behind that ordinary mask, they were cataloging human lives like cattle, turning women into inventory, vanishing them into the dark. The miners of Leadville believed in ghosts because they lived close to death. They believed the McKenna still walked because deep down they feared what the sisters represented. Not just murder, but betrayal. The realization that the very people who offered you a smile, a drink, a song, could be the ones to bury you under their floor. And maybe that is why, more than a century later, the McKenna sisters are still remembered. Not because of the trial or the gallows, not because of the 23 bundles folded beneath the saloon, but because their story forces us to look at the thin veil between hospitality and horror, between the warmth of human company and the cold ledger of exploitation. Leadville's winters are still long and hard. The wind still howls across the empty streets, rattling the shutters of abandoned boarding houses. And if you find yourself walking alone there, some night when the moon is hidden and the snow crunches underfoot, you may hear footsteps behind you. 2 sets, keeping pace. Perhaps you'll catch the faintest whiff of lilac and smoke. And if you glance over your shoulder, you may see 2 women in outdated dresses, their faces pale, their eyes dark. They will smile at you, as though offering company, as though inviting you to share a drink. If that happens, the old-timers say, do not follow, do not listen, do not let them lead you anywhere near the place where their saloon once stood. For the McKenna sisters are still serving, and what they pour, no man or woman ever lives to finish. Even now, on winter nights when the streets are empty and the mountains loom like sentinels in the moonlight, some say you can hear them. 2 women laughing softly, their voices blending with the wind. And if you listen long enough, you will realize they are not laughing with you. They are laughing at you.